Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is James Maffie. James is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Maryland and an affiliate in the Latin American Studies program. He's the author of Aztec Philosophy, Understanding a World in Motion, a book that details the non-dual metaphysics of the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples. And it's this philosophy that we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. So your book is called Aztec Metaphysics, but you mentioned in it how the people we're discussing, Aztec doesn't quite capture the whole range of the people. Could you explain who these kind of Mesoamerican people are that we'll be discussing?
Let's see. Well, I guess we're going to be talking about, well, we can take broadly or narrowly. We can speak narrowly of the Aztecs or the Mexica. And then we can speak a little bit more broadly of people who speak the same language as they do, who share a lot of the same, I think, sort of religion, culture, philosophy as they do. They all speak the language called Nahuatl. So scholars commonly refer to them as Nahuas. I think and a lot of the themes, philosophical themes that we'll be talking about are shared widely throughout what scholars call Mesoamerica.
Right. So the Nahuatl people is maybe the more scholarly accurate term, although Aztecs are the ones that people are more familiar with as kind of a subset of the Nahuatl.
Yeah, some of the sources, some of the people interviewed for what passes as some of the primary sources, but they're really secondary sources, were not inhabitants of Tenochtitlan and were therefore, properly speaking, not Mexica. They lived across the lake in another town, maybe Texcoco or elsewhere. So it's a little safer to speak of Nahuatl, not Nahuas or Nahuatl speakers.
Right. Yeah, it might be worth kind of situating this historically as well, right? Because in researching this, I was reading how the Aztec Empire consisted of kind of a triple alliance of three different indigenous groups, one of which was the Mexica, from which we get Mexico.
Right.
And you mentioned Tenochtitlan, this kind of the capital city with monumental pyramids, right? And the center of this empire. And in the 1600s, I guess, when there's kind of European colonization, is that where a lot of the kind of sources comes from that you have to work with?
1500s.
Okay, 1500s.
Right. Yeah, the conquest, the official date of the conquest is 1521. I think it's August 21st or something. I can never recall. But yeah, so what our sources are, by historian standards, we have no primary sources. We do have is several painted, what are called codices by us, books that scholars variously call the content sort of pictographs, pictoglyphs. People argue these were not language-based, that you could understand these, even though you were not a Nahuatl speaker, that Mixtec speakers from further south could understand them. There's a sort of common symbolic code. But most of those, there were hundreds and hundreds of those. The Spaniards burned them, of course, because they were the work of the devil. We have several codices which are copies of those, and then several that were painted under Spanish direction. The literate sources that we have are all post-conquest, because Nahuatl was not written. The orthography is the orthography of 16th century Spanish. And those consist primarily of a book compiled by a Franciscan named Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, who arrived after the fall of Tenochtitlan. He was not one of the first 12 Franciscans who arrived. And when Sahagún arrives, the conversion of native peoples is not going as successfully as the Spaniards would have liked. They believe that they've converted, lots and lots of people, and then they're shocked to find out that they're witnessing what they call recidivism, going back. But I mean, I'm not sure the people who were ever converted, they never really understood what was happening to them. So Sagun decides that in order to successfully convert people, you have to know something about them. You have to know where they're coming from. So he gets the young men who are attending school that the Spaniards founded, the Colegio de Santa Cruz, which is in Tlatelolco, which is sort of a sister city of Tenochtitlan and on the same island. And in that school, these young men who were native Nahuatl speakers also learn Latin and Spanish and, Christian theology. He compiled a list of questions that he wanted answered, and he gave it to them, and they brought these questions out into the field, into the community, and asked various surviving elders all sorts of questions like, what did your calendar look like? How did mothers and fathers address their young sons and daughters upon, reaching age, coming upon age? How did you celebrate this and that? And it's a large volume. So the Sagun brought back the results. He sort of compiled them and massaged them, and did so according to late medieval sort of categorical or conceptual schemes. But he preserved the original Nahuatl, and with that on the facing page, he had Spanish. So we have there some 16th century Nahuatl. In the book, here's one volume of the book. It's now been translated into English. One side's Nahuatl, the other side English, and there are 12 of these. So it's a large source, but one has to approach it with what people call a hermeneutics of suspicion, since it's been filtered by Sagun and he's got an axe to grind. There's several books by a Dominican named Fray Diego de Duran, and he was fluent in Nahuatl as well, like Sagun, and he wrote various histories and sort of descriptions of the rites of the Aztec people. So then later on, we have sources that were written by survivors from other cities who were enemies of the Aztecs and who wrote histories that did as much as they possibly could to make the Aztecs look as evil and stupid as possible. Histories which they wrote in order to ingratiate themselves to the Spaniards as much as possible. And we've got a 16th century dictionary of Mexican and Castilian, which is invaluable source, since the compiler, a guy named Alonso de Molina, another friar, just wrote down lists of Nahuatl words, and they're compounds. So in Nahuatl, you have these sort of roots, and then you can agglutinate large, what people call word sentences out of that's one word, which usually is a complete assertion. So we've got all of that. So that's our source. Less literate, of course, is archaeological remains and things like that. So we have the linguistics. Other sort of sources people rely upon, we Nahuatlists, as we're called, engage in oftentimes what's called upstreaming, that you read contemporary ethnographies of Nahuatl speaking people who survived and who now, practice native ways, more or less, and other people in the, larger linguistic family of the Aztecs. They were part of the Uto-Aztecan linguistic group. And then you look at other contemporary folks in what is now Mexico, and you try to sift through, sort out what's an African imposition, what's a Spanish Christian imposition. You try to get a sense of what is historic in what is present, right? What can we, so you kind of then upstream and say, this looks like it was, conquest era, and you try to fit it into what we know about the conquest era beliefs.
Right.
So
And
it's highly interpretive and hermeneutical.
right, yeah, it sounds there's a lot of detective
A
work
lot of
going on as
detective,
well. Yeah,
yeah, which
and
makes it a lot of fun.
I'm sure. Yeah, and so I mean, your work is fascinating, looking at the philosophy, the metaphysics, the kind of picture of reality of these people, and yeah, I wonder if you could start with I guess the kind of the core idea, which I assume is teot, that you would begin with to
Uh-huh.
explain this worldview.
So at the core idea is this notion that reality consists of teot, this sort of sacred power, energy, life force. Um, and that is the ultimate constituent of reality. Everything consists of life force, of power, of energy. So that means ultimately that everything is, in some broad sense of the word, animated, alive. If it's here and if it's existing, then it exists by virtue of having power and life force in it. So ultimately, teot is also the only thing that exists. And you and I, tables, trees, chairs, cats, dogs, ducks, are all part of teot. So we're all sort of made up of teot and one with teot. So you have this, and teot is this, basic energy. The Mexica embrace what Western philosophers call a process metaphysics, as opposed to a substance or entity or thing metaphysics. And that means that the ultimate stuff of reality is a process or processes. There can be processes nested within processes, whereas most Western metaphysics tends to be sort of substance or entity focused. We think that there are things and happen to things. Things can undergo processes, but the ultimate building blocks, the word noun, blocks, are things like atoms or substances or people or dogs or cats, right? And they undergo processes, but the ultimate building blocks are blocks, things, atoms. For the process metaphysics, the ultimate building is a process. So everything, you just have this constant circulating energy, life force, and motion. And it's constantly circulating and processing and becoming and changing throughout the cosmos. Another feature of this is that for the Mexica, that which is real is that which changes. That may not sound weird, but I mean, if you think of Western metaphysics, Western theology, it's pretty much guided by the basic intuition that that which is real is that which never changes. God is immutable, unchanging, right? God's love, or Jesus's love, is immutable. It's unchanging. It's always there. It's eternal. We have this notion that if something's real, it doesn't change, because change is a sign of imperfection. If you go back as far as Plato, with Plato's forms, his abstract entities, they're timeless, they're eternal, they're immutable. And the world in which we live, which he likens to a cave in the Republic, is a realm of change, because everything is, because everything's unreal. But for the Mexica, that which is real changes. To be real is to change, to become, to transform, right? And to move about, both moving in terms of sort of physically, but also moving in terms of qualitatively. Like I move through my life, my life death cycle. That's a kind of movement for them. So there's another very, very fundamental difference, is this notion that everything is moving, everything is changing. And despite that, all of that which changes and moves and change and becomes is real. So notions of, heaven where nothing never changes are quite literally sort of ill-conceived. They don't make sense by this way of thinking.
Right. Yeah. This way of thinking completely fits with my intuitions as a scientist as well, where, in my own work, I kind of studied the brain and how it builds concepts of things. And so I tend to think of reality as a process that then the brain comes up with these concepts that it kind of overlays and comes up with ideas, symbols that are eternal in a sense. They don't change. They're an interpretation overlay. And then a lot of philosophical problems, I think, arise when we mistake those concepts for being out there in the world. We have our concept of something as being solid, And then we interrogate that and we say, well, actually, whether it's Theseus's ship and you're swapping out the planks, and then you realize there is no solid concept here that exists out there in the world. Instead, there's just this process that's kind of beyond concepts, beyond naming. Yeah. So this philosophy, I think, seems to be very wise to me. It also seems to pop up from reading your work. I can't help but see parallels with things like Taoism and even Spinoza's work. It seems like multiple people have come up with this similar insights into this kind of unitive process metaphysics.
Yeah, it's clearly there in Taoism. I think you're there in Spinoza. I don't know the extent to which Spinoza's God is always in motion and always changing, but this Spinoza's notion that of what philosophers call neutral monism, that there's one stuff and it's neither mind nor body, it's neutral between that. So that's a false duality, mind versus body. It's a false duality for Taoism. You have, and this chi energy, which can manifest in various forms, vapor, liquid, or solid, but it's all basically the same stuff. And this intuition, native people that you listen to don't see it so much as an intuition, actually, as just a basic fundamental perception. It's not the process of some elongated process of abstract reflection. It's not a theoretical positing or speculation at the end of lots of theorizing. It's at the ground floor. There's a excellent philosopher guy named Leroy Littlebear, who's Blackfoot. I highly recommend you hook up with him. Check if you could. He might actually do an interview, but he's lots of videos online. He sort of gave the Blackfoot Imprimatur to a book. Maybe you know this book by David Peat, who is an associate of. Is it David Peat? Of Bohm, called Blackfoot Metaphysics. But it's basically the whole notion, and I think it's throughout Mesoamerica, and I think you find it in the Andes as well, and in the indigenous New World. There's this notion that everything is in flux, everything is always moving and changing, and how to live well is a matter of how to to balance yourself amidst all that change, rather than try to escape the world and go to some transcendent anchor, which, rock of ages, which never changes, which you can hold on to and say, okay, change is freaking me out, but I know I can count on this, right? Because it's real, because it doesn't change. And that's just folly by their lights.
Yeah, I think it's this, you mentioning how this doesn't kind of come at the end of a long series of theorizing. It seems that the reason to me that this can pop up in multiple different places is because it seems to often come with introspection. Yes, this is especially the case with something like Taoism, that it's, people look at their own experience and they notice it's kind of constantly changing. And what comes along with that is a sense of reality being sacred as well, which is a kind of difficult word to maybe pin down. But to me, it conjures up feelings of this greater reality being awe-inspiring, worthy of reverence, not necessarily a quality that's out there in the world that we can say it is objectively sacred, but it's more we hold it to be sacred, and that leads us to living wisely in alignment with it, which I think what you were just pointing to as well.
Yeah, I would say they think it's objectively sacred. Right? These views tend to be not very anthropocentric in any respect. We tend to interpret them as being anthropocentric and anthropomorphic, but they're not. It's sacred because it is awesome, but it's awesome because it's huge, it's powerful, all-encompassing, all-enveloping. So it is overwhelming in the way you describe, but I think, at least for them, that reaction is a function of its objective nature. It is, there it is, a hurricane, a tornado, a glacial ice sheet. That is objectively, right, sacred, powerful, overwhelming.
Right. And you mentioned that in kind of technical jargon, it has both kind of ontological and constitutional monism, right? There's this holistic picture to this view.
So you have what yeah, everything's one thing, teot, ontological monism, and then everything's made up of the same stuff. So that's the sort of constitutional monism. Another feature of this is the holism, and what you might call interrelationalism is that everything is interrelated. And this is key because everything is sort of, I mean, in a lot of ways, the view is very aware of ecology, that all of these processes are interrelated and interdependent, and they affect one another. But there's this notion, more specifically, that human beings are in the midst of this set of relationships, and they're related to all of this. And we exist in this set of relationships, and a moral norm will come out of that, is that in order to maintain balance, one has to keep those relationships well balanced. This force, teot can sort of multiply in various sorts of ways, but it's always it. And so you have what Europeans have always thought were gods, and the original Franciscans thought that the Aztecs were polytheists. They tried to understand the Aztecs or the Mexican the best way they knew how, I guess, and that was to look to their own past, and they thought they were Romans, basically, and that various Aztec deities were like, Tlaloc, Quetzalcoatl, Tezcatlipoca, were like Zeus and so forth. But these are really just sort of personified forces of nature, sort of congeries or collections of forces, much like you and I, but who have a personality or character. And so human beings are born in the middle of basically a world that's comprised of persons. It's sort of a social ontology on top of everything else we've said. The world consists of a lot of persons. Human beings are born into this. The ethics comes out of this. We're the sort of creator beings, or these personified forces who are not different in kind from us. They just happen to be more powerful than us, because everything, remember, is always made out of teot. So there ultimately is no human divine distinction, supernatural, natural distinction. Everything's the same, homogeneous, ontologically speaking. But sometimes it can sort of pool or congeal, and you get, persons or agents who are more powerful than others. So these creator beings, as we could call them, create this world. And as a result, they are exhausted, they're hungry, they're tired. And so they create human beings in order to nourish them. So human beings are sort of gifted life. They're gifted into existence by these beings, these personified forces. And as a result of that, human beings are born with an obligation to regift, to reciprocate. So rather than original sin as some sort of mark of black mark or something you have to atone for, do penance for, human beings are born with a debt, in the same way that they, and many cultures around the world, Confucianism stands out, that you and I are born indebted to our mother and father, filial duty. They went out of their way, they went to great effort, especially your mother, to give birth to us, and now we're obligated to reciprocate, to take care of them in their old age. So the Mexica embrace that as well, but in this case, it's the creator beings gifted us into existence. They put out their life energy in order to bring us into existence, and now we're obligated to re-gift them. And we need to do that because if we don't, they will cease to exist and the world will cease to exist. So human beings have a special sort of obligation or responsibility, and that's to keep the world going. It doesn't make us, the crown of creation, doesn't make us top dog the way you get in, Christian metaphysics, that, we're human beings, we can trash the world, God made it for us, to dominate and exploit. No, I mean, we have this duty, this obligation to keep the thing going. And we do that by sort of regifting life energy back up to nature. So, and we try to keep this thing in balance. So we feed them, but then they in turn feed us. So it ends up being this constant sort of back and forth reciprocity. We gift them life energy, they gift us life energy, right? And so it turns out, even if you were tempted to think that there was some qualitative ontological distinction between humans and creator beings, it turns out to be false, because we feed them our life energy, they feed them our life energy, and you are what you eat. So we are made out of God stuff and they're made out of human stuff. So we're all, once again, ultimately made up of the same stuff. But we do have this obligation to keep the world going. And that's the specific focus of Mexica rituals, is keeping the balance going. And if things get out of balance, it's like, blood stops flowing properly in the brain or through the body, you get a stroke, you get an obstruction, things mess up when they're in balance. So they're always trying to keep balance, restore balance, maintain balance.
And is that where maybe the thing that the Aztecs are most famous for is the human sacrifice rituals? Are they part of this kind of an offering to this process to keep it going?
Yeah, I mean, they don't have a notion of sacrifice per se, because the word right from Latin means to make sacred, and they're not really making anything sacred because everything already is sacred. What they are doing is putting forward, the word that comes closest is to offer or to gift, to put forward. So yeah, but I mean, they gift lots of things. Dough, maize, amaranth dough figures, flowers, dancing, singing, words, incense. All of these contain life-sustaining, life-nourishing energy, and the Mexica are always sending those up, gifting them to the gods. Human blood and human hearts is one of them, but it's not actually, by their lights, it's not the most important one. Actually, the most important one is speech. If you look at the Quiche Maya book, the Popol Vuh, maybe you've heard of it. I mean, there too, the creator beings create human beings in order to nourish them. And the principal means by which humans are meant to nourish the gods is through, well, what we would call prayer, but through words, because words have power, right? It's not the modern view that, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. For them, speech is a powerful way of communicating and transmitting energy. And so it's through song and dance and prayer. All these transmit and feed the gods through praise and adoration.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, these kinds of process-based spiritual kind of unitive worldviews, I think people it seems in the West have tended to feel that they go hand in hand with more kind of anarchic modes of organization, more decentralized, but in the Aztec Empire we see kind of, again, human sacrifice, deeply hierarchical, kind of expansionist, and it's interesting to me that these two things could coexist. And the only way, my kind of speculative way of making sense of it is, I was reading about that the sun is a hugely important factor, right, in their life, and that these offerings are often made to the sun. And as living systems, we really are dependent. We're a kind of thermodynamic process that depends on energy from the sun. So I think they correctly intuit that that's the most important aspect. If the sun goes out, then it's death for all of us. And so there's a kind of an attempt to influence that process. And I guess it feels to me almost like fear of mortality, or fear of the life process ending, leads to this maybe heavy-handed culture of control where it's kind of hierarchy and human sacrifice. But that's just a speculation throwing out there, because I find it interesting these two things kind of coexist in their culture.
Yeah, I mean, if the sun's important, but so is the earth. If you look at the main temple in the heart of Tenochtitlan, within what's called the sacred precinct, then there's the main temple, In Spanish, they call it the Templo Mayor, the big one, or in Nahuatl, it's the Hueteocalli. It's the big one. So it's this big pyramid, but on top of the pyramid, there are two smaller temples. One's devoted to the Huitzilopochtli, representing the sun. The other one's to Tlaloc, which represent earth and water. So both of them are on top of there because you need both earth and water, sun and water, not earth and water, sun and water, sunlight and water energy to live. So the sort of focus upon the sun, I think, is a little bit overemphasized. There are lots and lots of giftings, or what we call sacrifices, to Tlaloc, to the earth, because you need every growing season, you need water, you need those rains. There are two seasons, wet and dry, and the sun is associated with the dry, and Tlaloc is associated with the wet. And they're equally important, and they're symbiotic, right? They have this notion that they're, hearkening to Taoism of yin and yang, there's male, female, sun, water, fire, water, above, below, all those sort of dualities or polarities are there. And it's built right into the Templo Mayor, the big temple, big pyramid. I guess I don't think of that, what you described it as autarky. To my knowledge, Andean civilizations are equally process-oriented, and they can be very hierarchical. Other Mesoamericans, Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, Olmec, they're all hierarchical as well. And they all, the aforementioned, tend to be rather expansionist. They do have this notion that they've got to balance the world. And I think a lot of what's going on, although not exclusively, is that they're trying to balance larger and larger pieces of the world to bring it into balance. I don't know if the philosophy is going to explain everything, say the Mexica ever did, like every imperialistic, adventure they did. I sort of get asked this question because people think that the philosophy or their religion has to be manifested in every action the empire ever undertook. And I'm just not sure it was. Think of Christianity. How can you have such a religion of love be one of the bloodiest religions in history of the planet the last 500 years? How is it that Christians go to war with one another, they're constantly killing one another and killing non-Christians? How do you reconcile that with Christian philosophy? So, it's the same sort of disconnect, I think.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, I think. Yeah, that a lot goes into how people live their lives, a lot of forces, not just the philosophy. We don't just live purely from a philosophical stance. And you mentioned this kind of duality, which I think is really interesting. It seems to be quite foundational, right? This kind of reality being made of these kinds of mutually dependent co-arising factors, like you can't have wet without dry, and they're kind of equally balanced. Maybe you could speak a bit more on that.
Well, one of the principal ways that Teot manifests itself is through these polarities, male, female, hot, cold, wet, dry, above, below, fire, water. And these are mutually dependent, mutually arising, mutually completing. And what they do is just, think about, in Mexico, there are two seasons. And so you just go wet season, dry, wet season, dry season, wet season, dry season, wet season. It just sort of is cyclical, going back and forth. And these are, you can't have one without the other. So if you think about life and death as part of these polarities, you can't have life without death, because life feeds upon the life energy of something else. You have to kill something in order to stay alive. So there's a notion of eternal life without any death, sort of a Christian notion of heaven, once again, is ill-conceived. It just doesn't make any sense. You cannot possibly have life without death. And death feeds upon life. So life and death sort of, they have a struggle going on, but they never attempt to extinguish one another. Life never tries to conquer death. Death never tries to conquer life, because both know that they need the other in order to keep surviving. So they're mutually interdependent. They're mutually arising, because death arises out of life and life arises out of death. And they complete one another in the sense that they bring each other to sort of completion. They help the other one complete its cycle. In the way that, if you and I are tennis partners, we spar, we don't try to kill one another, but my pushing you and you pushing back on me, we help, complete one another, develop our skills as tennis players, but we never try to kill one another. Absent from all of this are two important things then, is that there's no sort of polarity between goodness and such and evil and as such. So that sort of a Manichaean notion that gets swept up into a lot of Christian thinking is completely absent. So life isn't good per se or bad per se. Death isn't inherently good, inherently evil. They're neither. So there are good and bad actions, morally right and wrong actions, but they're not manifestations of goodness versus evil. So you don't have God versus the devil fighting it out. At the end of history, either goodness or darkness, the God or the devil will win out in the end. That's just not there. And so you don't have this Manichaean notion of fight to the death. You just have constant recycling, life, death, life, death, life, death, or, for us it'd be winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. The yin yang sign, the circle with the two little teardrops in it, one's black, one's white. If you could just, animate that, that's what it would be like. You just have it go like this. And that's how these cycles work. So all of us are ineliminably, irreducibly, both male and female, hot, cold, wet, dry, all of us. Even my male viral member has male and female parts to it. Okay, so everything is sort of ambiguous in the sense that everything is both male and female, but in a sense, neither exclusively male nor female. So together, so everything is this sort of ambiguous both ways and yet neither at the same time. Do I have a light death mask around here?
Yeah, I saw in one of your talks these interesting masks split down the middle, right, where it's kind of death and life on either side.
Yeah, I don't have one, but I mean, they're this. Yeah, I forgot where I was.
That's okay. You're talking about the fact that we all have kind of the masculine and the feminine within us, and it makes me think of kind of Jungian psychology. This is a facet of it where we all contain the anima and the animus. And in one of your lectures, I heard you talk about how the warriors that Aztecs would meet on the field of battle were always considered female, right? But they might
their
be
opponents.
Right, their opponents were, and so, but they may be considered male in other parts of their lives. So from different perspectives and different situations, we express these different things, or we're identified as these different things.
Right. Yeah. So the world is very sort of messy and complex in that way. It's not clear cut male versus female, or hot versus cold.
And is it kind of ambiguous? I mean, you'd write about kind of ambiguity, but it's almost that the world isn't a given. In science, we tend to assume the world is a certain way, and then we describe it, right? But actually, it's kind of you can't get away from the fact that it's always this kind of ambiguous thing that's seen from multiple perspectives. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to put it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a dominant metaphysical intuition in the West, at least as far back as Plato, that there's a single way the world is. And if it looks blurry or ambiguous, it's an epistemological problem. Right. We just don't quite understand it, because the world is determinate and clear cut. And I don't think the Mexica or lots of other people, Taoists, for example, Confucians, other Americans believe that. I think they think that the world is objectively metaphysically messy and ambiguous, and that the ambiguity isn't a function of us not being smart enough yet, not coming up with the right experiment yet, but it's just the way it is. And so living wisely is knowing how to live with that and, play off that ambiguity.
Yeah, it seems to me that in 20th century physics, with the kind of when people started peaking below the level of the atom, I wonder if these cultures would have been less surprised than Western science. As you see these kind of seemingly paradoxical, odd behaviors that are highly contextually dependent, and I wonder if they would have been more embracing of these things and thought, well, obviously this is the way the fundamental nature of reality is.
If you listen to some of Leroy Littlebear's lectures on YouTube, he says, yeah, we knew that all along. What took you so long?
Right. Yeah, this doesn't seem obvious from your own experience.
Yeah. So,
and you mentioned the kind of the duality of life and death being kind of dependent on each other. There's a god, is it Tlazolteotl, who's the kind of god of sacred excrement, and there's this kind of idea of, I guess, this ecological vision of fertilizer, right, being a kind of necessary part of the whole thing. Yeah,
I mean, she's gendered; it's a she, and it's sort of Tlazoli is part of her name's made up of Tlazoli, and it can be excrement, but it's also just anything that's sort of messed up and disordered. Sort of paradigmatic examples are like, a woven doormat. It's really well ordered at first, and then after years and years of use, it just becomes tattered and frayed, and it becomes Tlazoli. It becomes sort of disordered, deranged, and things like that are not only deranged, but they're deranging. They're disordering of things around them, because everything is sort of has an influence, an effect upon its environment. So those things you don't want to, blow them up and eliminate them from the universe, but you want to make sure you put them where they belong, and where they belong, as you said in this case, put them out in the field and use them as humus. They're fertilizer. Human excrement falls in there, and it's sacred, which flies in the face of everything Abrahamic religion that I know. That everything is according to my limited knowledge, everything associated with the body, bodily excrement, bodily fluids, bodily smell, the body is profane, and you want to try to minimize it. And as you recall, Luther opposed Copernicanism on the grounds that it would turn the earth into a heavenly body, and the earth was profane. It couldn't possibly be heavenly. And they just say, yeah, well, it's an important part of the, ecological cycle. Without fertilizer, you don't get food. Without food, we don't live. So, so this is a sacred aspect of nature, of the ecological cycle, of the circulation of energy, is messed up stuff, because it's fertilizing. And
you mentioned earlier that these Spanish kind of took these deities and kind of thought of them as personified kind of Roman style polytheistic pantheon of deities, but in fact it's more, I guess you could say, pantheistic, and that you mentioned they represent kind of clusters of natural processes. And is it that the kind of the border between these different deities is kind of ambiguous, and they kind of contain each other?
Yeah, they pretty much, they're all ambiguous in the sense that they both contain both of these polarities within them. But they sort of blur into one another. They can sort of, they fission and they fusion. They split up into various parts, and they come together in various ways. You have Tlaloc, who's, god of rain, but thunder. You think of rain as water, but there's also lightning. So he's got fire. So there's an aqueous and a fiery igneous aspect of him. He also has a sort of a female earthly water counterpart. So she's more dominantly male. And, but then, the earth has volcanoes. So you have these violent, fiery eruptions. Everything kind of blurs. Yeah. You can focus on, say, look, I really want rainfall this spring for my crops. And you can kind of like focus upon specific aspects of Tlaloc, but you don't want, Tlaloc going overboard with a thunderstorm, a hailstorm, or, late winter snowstorm, or lightning destroying things. So yeah, you're always trying to keep these things well balanced.
Right. And in your work, you mentioned kind of an interest in order, keeping things orderly to kind of, I guess, take care of the whole process. But is it, I think you alluded to this, that you're not trying to eliminate and eradicate disorder and make orderliness win, right? How does that, what kind of order is it that they're interested in?
What kind of order?
That might be a strange question, but when we think of...
if you look at the city's ordered into 4 parts. Ethics, political philosophy is all about sort of arranging people, putting them in a particular sort of order so that they interact properly.
Right. So it's not about kind of rigidly controlling everything and getting rid of any disorder. It's more about wisely kind of
actually it's both.
Processes.
A human being who is a source of disorder, a murderer, you eliminate it.
Right.
The disorder, which is Tlatzolteotl, you don't eliminate it, but you put it out in the fields. So you try to, one of the ways that energy circulates is from center to periphery. So you're always trying to put the disorderly stuff out into the periphery. The periphery is usually wild and disordered. Wild animals can live out there. Wild humans live out there. Chichimecs live out there. But those energies you want to come back and circulate. So, it's a matter of, they're obsessed with sweeping, for example, with bathing. At least the ruling class, Moctezuma, one of the leaders at the time that Cortez arrived, bathed 2 or 3 times a day. And you compare that with Europeans who I recently read, I don't know if it's true, bathed 3 times their whole life, when they were born, when they were married, and when they died. They were sweeping, making sure that everything is sort of, that sort of biblical notion, that a place for everything and everything in its place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's manifested in the art, sort of like organizing how words are put together, organizing how, feathers or mosaics or jewelry is put together. They're always sort of arranging things so that they work well together, right, and in balance.
And you mentioned this kind of flowing of energy from the center to the periphery. And places like the capital city, right, are on a crossroads and have this kind of axis mundi characteristic, right?
Right. So the city Tenochtitlan in particular, that main temple and the sacred precinct around it are at the axis mundi, or, the belly button, the navel of the cosmos. And it's the center of the crossroads. Unlike European sort of folklore, which tends to see the crossroads as a sort of a dangerous place of witchcraft, satanic activity, you bury suicides in the crossroads. I'm not quite sure why that is. There are too many choices going on. But for the Mexica, the crossroads is the sweet spot. That's exactly where you want to be, because that's the most balanced place in the cosmos, both vertically and horizontally. And that's where, it's the most, metaphysically speaking, balanced, but it's also the place where you have greatest access to, divine powers. You have the greatest success at sort of transmitting life energy to the creator beings. It's where all important activity takes place. When you want to, every 52 years, the Mexica thought, the calendar ran out. They had 2 different calendars, a 365-day calendar, and they had a 260-day calendar, and they meshed every 52 years. And every 250 years, they were worried. They had to renew the sun. And this is an important activity that had to take place in the Valley of Mexico, because it was a balanced place.
And so the philosophy we're talking about, does that all take place in the 250-year period of the fifth age, the fifth sun?
200. No, the fifth sun just keeps going. It isn't dated so far, unless
Okay.
52 years was every cycle just of the sun. But
Okay.
the fifth age can keep going on. One of the things, you mentioned earlier, they were sort of haunted by mortality. They are haunted by the sense that the world they live in is ripe for falling. It's the fifth one out of four. They were the only Mesoamericans who had a fifth. Everybody else thinks that their particular age is the fourth. And fifth is significant because it's a full count in a 20-based counting system. 5 is a full count. It's as much as your hand can hold. And there are lots of words associated with fiveness, which have to do with fullness, with completion, with being so full and complete. You're so ripe that you're about ready. If you were a fruit, you'd be ready to fall off the tree. You're at that peak, and they see this world as sort of this ripe fruit, right? Which could at any minute fall from the tree. So they're constantly trying to keep it going.
Right. And so there are these cycles, right, of cataclysm and renewal with the suns. Perhaps you could explain that for the audience.
Well, let's see, there is, let me first recommend to folks a very good sort of animated film called The Five Suns, S-U-N-S, put out by University of California, Berkeley School Extension. It's really, really good, explains this very well. So you have sort of Teot, creator beings sort of existing, and then Teot kind of morphs into somebody else called Ome Teot, who is two Teot. And then you have Ome Teot sort of morphing into Ome Sihuat, Ome Tekutli, which is two lord, two lady. And they beget, these four sons that are sometimes called the four Tezcatlipoca's, but one of them's is Quetzalcoatl. So they assigned to Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, two of these sons, the job of creating worlds. When worlds are called suns because each world has a different sun that sort of drives it, makes it go. The first one, I forget the precise order, but the first four alternate between Quetzalcoatl creates one, then Tezcatlipoca destroys it. Tezcatlipoca makes the second, Quetzalcoatl destroys it. Quetzalcoatl destroys the third, Tezcatlipoca destroys it. Tezcatlipoca makes the fourth, Quetzalcoatl destroys it. Each one of those four is identified with one of the four elements: water, wind, fire, and earth. The fifth one, we've run out of elements. The fifth one is going to be very unique. Its name is motion. And it's the only one that actually moves. And so in this fifth one, it's said that Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl decided to bury their differences, sort of get together in this sort of economic way. Actually, here's a picture of Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl's this guy, and Tezcatlipoca's here. They get together and they decide to work together, and pretty much having that notion of polarities, working together in order to bring about something. So they bring about this fifth sun, this fifth age, which is defined not by one of the four primary elements, but by motion. And its name is for motion. And it's defined by motion. And it's said that it will come to an end through motion, earthquakes. And so it's the fifth and final. After this one, the Mexica, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. They just don't know. One of the things I think distinguishes them from Western philosophers, starting with the Greeks, is I don't think they spend a lot of time with metaphysical speculation. I think they spend most of their time with practical speculation, how to live. There's a scholar of East Asia named Roger Ames who distinguishes what he calls truth-seeking and path-seeking philosophies. Truth seekers are ones who want to seek the truth, and they typically engage in metaphysical speculation. They want to, before acting, they always want to get to the truth of things. They think there's a single way reality is, and they want to get to it. Path seekers, by contrast, spend not so much time speculating about what is or isn't the case, what's true or what isn't true, but how to proceed. They want to know what the path is. Taoism is an obvious example of a path seeker. I think the Meshikas are path seekers. Most Western philosophy is truth seekers. If you know the famous parable, the poison arrow from Buddhism, I guess it's the Buddha, comes across a man with a shot with a poison arrow one day. And he goes, hey, I know how to pull that poison arrow out of your back and save your life. And the man goes, wow, that's really great. But before you pull it out, I want to know what the truth is. I want to know who the guy shot me. What language does he speak? What did he look like? How tall was he? And what kind of poison's in that arrow? And where are the feathers from? On and on and on. Before you do anything, we got to get down to the truth. What happens? The man dies. What's the moral? Truth is a fatal distraction. Buddhism teaches a how, not a what. This is also, what American pragmatism is all about, a how, not a what as well. So both Taoism, at least this strain of school in Buddhism, and I think Confucianism, and I think Native American philosophies are this sort of path-oriented. They don't spend a lot of time speculating about metaphysics, and therefore condemned as not being real philosophies by Western philosophers who think that that's pretty much what you have to do in order to be a philosopher. I forget how I got onto this, but so they spend most of their time trying to get through life. One of the questions is, how do we balance on this slippery earth? It's always moving. It's like riding a kayak down a stream or riding a bicycle. How do we balance? How do we not slip and fall into disorder and dis-ease and death? How do we keep this thing going? Which is, what Confucianism's about, what Taoism's about. They're all about how do we keep going? How do we continue going?
Right. And it seems to me that, ancient Greek philosophy seemed to have a bit more, even though it was obviously also dealing with truth and metaphysics, or thought it was, it also spoke to kind of eudaimonia, increasing well-being, how to live well, right? And it seems we've been on a trajectory away from that over time, I guess.
Yeah, I think Western philosophy's completely abandoned the whole quest for wisdom.
Right. And then you mentioned this kind of task of learning to walk on the very slippery earth, and there are multiple kinds of motion change, right, in this worldview that I guess make it tricky for us to navigate wisely through the world.
Yeah, there's sort of three patterns or shapes of change. They're not different kinds of change, but they're all just different ways that change manifests itself. And there's one which is called Orderliness, which is, I didn't know I should have pictures available. It's sort of the motion of sort of a parabolic motion, sort of this way, or the motion of a bouncing ball. And the word Orlin comes from an Olmec word named Ule, which means rubber in Olmec. And so it's from rubber bouncing balls. And that's the motion of a beating heart, respiring chest. It's the motion, it's the sun when the sun goes up and below and up and over the herd like this. And that's right, going this. It also goes back and forth this way, from winter solstice to summer solstice, going back and forth. So this kind of motion defines one particular kind of activity in the world. It's also the shape of our own life-death cycles. It has 4 stages, and it's how it's sort of like the heartbeat of the motion, or the look of the motion of the heartbeat of the 5th age and of us. There's a second called Malinali, which sort of a twisting, churning, double helical motion. And it's the motion that's involved with things coming into existence. It's with energy transmission between different creatures in the universe. Say the sun, that's the energy that's transmitted from the sun to, let's say, grass is spiral shaped. And then the grass absorbed that energy. When the rabbit comes and eats the grass, the digestive process in a rabbit, their intestines, like ours, are spiral shaped, and it cooks it. Cooking is spirally. And then when we eat the rabbit, we chew it, we cook it more spirally. So every stage. And then when we burn hearts, blood, burn paper, burn incense, all of that spiraling. So spiral motion changes takes things and orders it and transmits it between different sorts of creatures or different, layers of the cosmos. It's exhibited in like taking, rough. I just happen to have, rough. This is sort of pretty cleaned, but original cotton will have lots of seeds in it, and it's going from this stuff to thread, right? You order it and arrange it by spinning it, and that's one way of making things happen in the world. And then the third is called Nepantla, and it's sort of a back and forth motion of mutuality. And it's sort of that results in sort of the creation of a third thing, a tertium quid. It can be you, me, back and forth in a dialogue, becoming friends. I give out life energy to you, give it back to me. In a conversation, there's this dialogue or dialectic going back. And that's the way friendships are made, right? And that's the way bonds are created. It's the activity that's involved in two rivers coming together. River A converges with River B, and that confluence is a River C. It's a new river, which is neither A nor B, yet both A and B at the same time. And they come together and they go like this, and they create this new thing. There's a particular place, two rivers converge in Saskatchewan, and I don't remember the name of the rivers or where, but where they come together, one happens to be muddy and one happens to be very blue, one happens to be warm and one happens to be cold, and they come together. And the Blackfoot name for where they converge is where the two rivers become friends, right? That's what Nepantla is about. Sexual activity, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Sexual commingling is an example of this, where one does that and one creates a human being. Military action is also this: thrust, parry, thrust, parry, thrust, parry, thrust, parry. And weaving, you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And in weaving, you create this thing right out of thread, which is ultimately comes from this stuff. And being able to wear woven fabrics is one of the things that distinguishes being civilized for the Aztec as opposed to being sort of like uncivilized. Their uncivilized neighbors from the north, who they call Chichimecs, wear hides and furs. And I think that's just, barbaric. You've got to, this is civilized clothing, right? It's ordered clothing, and it orders us when we wear it. They literally believe, like we say, the clothes make the man. The clothes do something to you. So this Nepantla motion is the fundamental one, and it brings together Olin, and it brings together Malinali, and it weaves the cosmos in I'd say at one point that sort of Teot is sort of the weaver of the cosmos, the weaving of the cosmos, and the woven product of the weaving. It's all of those all at the same time. It's the doer, the doing, and the done, and the deed, right? And so perhaps the principal metaphor, I'm not sure how, it's not really a metaphor for the Mexica, is that the world is this weaving in progress. And what I find really neat about that is that weaving is a female gendered activity for them. So you think of them as bloodthirsty, heart ripping out people, badass warriors, but their dominant metaphysics is that of a female gendered activity. It's this weaving, this back and forth, putting together this and that. So yeah, those are three different sort of patterns or ways, patterns of transformation and becoming.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you for the back and forth of this conversation that's
Sure.
woven this. I've really enjoyed it. Would you send people to your book if they want to look into your work more, Aztec Metaphysics, or is there anywhere online?
No, it's not online. I don't know if you can pirate an electronic version or not.
I mean, rather, do you have any social media or website or any presence online?
Oh, do I? No, I'm
just the book, the old school way.
Backward when it comes to that. I keep telling myself I got to do that. But anybody who wants, I've got art, things I can send them. Anybody wants to write, email, questions, I'm always up for explaining things. But yeah.
Great. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.